It was a calm, ordinary night birdsong replaced by the hush of July air, young lovers parked beneath a dark sky. Then, without warning, a shadow stepped from the trees, a single gunshot cracked the silence, and the world that couple knew evaporated. The killer walked away into the night. He left behind blood, a torn shirt, and an envelope addressed to a local paper. Inside, a grid of strange symbols, a code written like a dare. Those symbols would become the Zodiac's signature, taunts mailed to newspapers, riddles thrown at detectives, and puzzles that sank into the public imagination for decades. For over 50 years the ciphers were an invitation and a trap. They promised meaning, the name, the motive, the face, but mostly they gave the world another sentence of menace, another proof that someone was watching, laughing behind ink and typewriter ribbon. Please help this channel grow, like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Tonight, we follow both the blood and the letters. We'll walk the crime scenes and the cryptograms, meet the victims and the survivors, examine the minds that tried to crack him and the algorithms that finally broke through. This is not just a story about murders. It's a story about language used as a weapon, about obsession, and about the thin, fragile line between code and confession. The late 1960s in Northern California, a place of sun and fog, highways that unspooled along the coast, and neighborhoods that still felt small enough for strangers to be noticed. Between 1968 and 1969 a figure anonymous, deliberate, and terrifying began to stitch a pattern across the Bay Area. He attacked couples parked in remote places. He shot a taxi driver. He sent letters to newspapers that combined boastful claims of dozens of victims with cryptic ciphers and a crooked circle and cross symbol that would be printed in headlines and plastered on wanted posters for years to come. The confirmed string of dead and wounded that investigators attribute to the Zodiac includes, most famously, the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen on December 20, 1968, the July 4 to 5, 1969 attack on Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau, in which Mageau survived, the Lake Berryessa stabbings of Bryan Hartnell and Cecelia Shepard on September 27, 1969, and the October 11, 1969 killing of taxi driver Paul Stine in San Francisco. Survivors like Michael Mageau and Bryan Hartnell would later become key witnesses, and the killer's letters would taunt both newsrooms and police, claiming more victims than could be verified. These facts form the backbone of the public case against the shadow that called himself Zodiac. But the murders were matched with something rarer and stranger than the typical serial killer's signature: cryptic, handwritten codes. The killer didn't just kill, he wrote. He sent typed and handwritten letters to the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and other papers. He signed with that symbol and sometimes included portions of victims' clothing, grotesque tokens meant to prove that his words were not idle. In the letters, he described himself with a mixture of grandiosity and grotesque humor. He claimed to be collecting slaves for the afterlife, he threatened bombings if the papers didn't print his notes, and he signed off like a performer who expected an audience to clap. The ciphers came in different shapes and sizes. 1. A 408-symbol message arrived in 1969 and was solved within a matter of days. It read like a boastful, broken English confession. The killer said he enjoyed killing and disliked hunting animals because murder was more fun. But 2 other ciphers stubbornly resisted solution: a 340-symbol grid that would stand as one of modern cryptography's most famous cold cases, and shorter fragments that have continued to tease researchers. For decades, those symbols were a quiet, insoluble chorus echoing through the investigation. Who was the man behind the symbol? Over the years, hundreds, by some counts thousands, of suspects have been named by amateur sleuths and professionals alike. The only man formally named by police as a suspect in the public record was an elementary school teacher, Arthur Leigh Allen. He died in 1992 and was never charged. Investigators kept the case open. Generations of hobbyists, journalists, and cryptographers kept turning the letters over in their hands. Yet for all the attention, the Zodiac's identity remained officially unresolved. This story sits at the intersection of violence and language. The letters were not mere attachments to the crimes, they were the crime's second act. In a way, the ciphers gave the Zodiac a stage. He used print and code to make people read him and to make others try to answer, which is exactly what he wanted. The sequence of attacks that would cement the Zodiac's notoriety began quietly but with devastating suddenness. The first confirmed attack on Lake Herman Road near Berryessa on December 20, 1968 targeted two teenagers in a parked car. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were young, their lives full of possibility. A single rifle blast ended the evening's small, ordinary ritual of young love. It was a crime that by itself would have been horrific. As the first in a chain, it became a prologue. By July 1969 the killer had struck again at Blue Rock Springs Park. Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau were in a car when a man approached, shot them both, and fled. Mageau's survival became maddeningly important. He could remember a fragmentary face, could deliver an eyewitness sketch, and would later identify under some circumstances a man he believed had shot him. The outcome that night, one dead, one wounded, and a second public crisis that began to feel like the pattern of a predator. 2 months later, a different brutality unfolded at Lake Berryessa. This attack was not a drive-by shooting, it was intimate and ritualistic. A young couple, Bryan Hartnell and Cecelia Shepard, were picnicking when a man wearing an odd hood with eye holes approached. He told them to tie up Mrs. Shepard and then stabbed both victims repeatedly. Bryan Hartnell survived and later provided a chilling eyewitness account. The attacker carved a symbol into Hartnell's car door, signed a statement, and left as if taking a final bow. Cecelia Shepard died of her injuries 2 days later. The make and method were different from the first killings, but the signature, the symbol, the communication with the press began to solidify. The final confirmed killing of Paul Stine, a taxi driver in San Francisco's Presidio Heights, had its own particular horror. It occurred in the heart of the city and, apparently, under the gaze of uniformed police who encountered a man fleeing the scene. The boldness of killing a cabbie in a dense, urban setting, then mailing a piece of the victim's shirt to a newspaper, intensified the terror. Each new crime escalated not only fear but audacity. The killer seemed to take satisfaction in theatricality, in the knowledge that his notes would be printed and his ciphers examined. Across these incidents, survivors and witnesses gave patchy descriptions, and forensic science in the late 1960s lacked tools we now take for granted. The Zodiac's letters, by contrast, were precise, deliberate artifacts, typed passages, odd punctuation, symbols arranged on paper with the confidence of someone who expected the world to read them. They provided investigators two paths: the physical evidence at crime scenes, and the symbolic evidence in ink. Often, the symbolic proved more resistant and more intoxicating to the public imagination. Each crime drew police attention from local departments and, eventually, the FBI. Detectives interviewed survivors, traced the movements of victims, and scoured the physical scenes for clues. The Zodiac was not a sloppy killer. He left little trace that could be tied to a single suspect with the standards of proof required for charges. Instead, he left words. The earliest breakthrough in the world of cryptography rather than policing came after a letter arrived containing a 408-symbol cipher. Within 5 days of publication, amateur and professional codebreakers, including Donald and Betty Harden, announced a solution. The message they recovered was crude and boastful, but it confirmed one thing: the killer loved to play with words as much as he did with weapons. The FBI corroborated the Harden's solution. That quick decrypt gave the Zodiac credibility in the public eye. If the coded letter could be read, maybe so could the man behind it. But not all the ciphers were so obliging. A 340-symbol cipher mailed in November 1969 baffled cryptologists. The grid of unfamiliar signs seemed to resist the substitution and frequency analyses that cracked so many code puzzles. For more than half a century, the Z340, as it came to be called, was a holy grail for hobby cryptographers and professionals alike, a tidy, maddening square asking, silently, "Who are you?" Attention inevitably turned to people who matched sketchy witness descriptions or who had odd, circumstantial connections to the crimes. Arthur Leigh Allen emerged as the most infamous suspect in public memory. Allen had been investigated by police, his house searched, and his name pushed into public view by authors and amateur sleuths. He owned a Zodiac watch, which featured a symbol similar to the killer's, had colorfully disturbing behavior in his past, and possessed other circumstantial ties that made him compelling to some investigators. But the pieces did not fit cleanly, crucial forensic links proved absent or inconclusive, and the most damning suggestions, handwriting matches or direct physical evidence, failed to reach the threshold required for arrest. Police ultimately were never able to charge Allen, and he died in 1992 still unconvicted. Over the years, detectives would admit that the Allen theory, like many in this case, revolved more around suspicion than proof. Over the decades, countless other names surfaced: local men with odd habits, ex-soldiers, reporters, and itinerant workers. Each claim spurred renewed media interest, but the case's public profile also incubated false leads and confident but unfounded declarations. In the kettle of the Zodiac myth, every new suspect was both an opportunity and a distraction. For investigators, decoding the ciphers was both practical and existential. If the ciphers could be read, the Zodiac might have inadvertently written his identity into a box of symbols. Yet ciphers are slippery, an apparent message can be a linguistic mirage, a chance pattern misread by eager eyes. The 408 solutions, broken grammar, and the remaining unsolved fragments taught a lesson: a solved cipher can be revealing, but it can also mislead. Still, generations of hobbyists made a life's work of chipping away at the Zodiac symbols. On forums, in basements, and inside university cryptology departments, people fed symbols into programs, tried transpositions, and looked for repeated motifs. The problem was both mathematical and human. Was the Zodiac a skilled cipher maker? Was he intentionally misleading? Or had he stitched together sloppy codes that only looked intricate because of time and myth? Then, in 2020, a turning point occurred. An international team of codebreakers, including David Orenchak, an American amateur cryptanalyst, Sam Blake, an Australian mathematician, and Jarl van Eyck, a Belgian programmer, announced they had decrypted the Z340. Using a combination of pattern analysis, computational tools, and a clever transposition approach, the team revealed a plaintext that, while not naming a person, contained taunting phrases and references to the killer's attitude toward death. The solution echoed the killer's earlier voice, menacing, theatrical, and concerned less with literal confession than with performance. The FBI verified the decryption. The triumph was technical and emotional. The long-standing cipher had succumbed to modern computation combined with patient human insights. For investigators and the public, that decryption was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it demonstrated the power of crowdsourced expertise and modern cryptanalysis. On the other, it gave no clear forensic lead. The Zodiac still had not been identified by name. The 340 solution read as arrogance and menace rather than a signature that could be tied to a single person. And the other, shorter ciphers and letter fragments, remained stubbornly ambiguous. With new cryptographic gains came new claims. In 2021, a private group of investigators known as the Casebreakers announced they had identified a man named Gary Francis Poste, who died in 2018, as the Zodiac. The group published a flurry of assertions, fingerprint correspondences, photo comparisons, and links to alleged clippings and handwriting, and argued that their collective experience in law enforcement and forensics supported the ID. Their claim ignited media attention and fierce debate. Law enforcement, including the FBI, publicly urged caution. The case remained open, and authorities reported no definitive conclusion based on the group's announcement. Local investigators also expressed skepticism about the strength of the Casebreakers' evidence. In short, new claims stirred the pot, but they did not provide the kind of proof prosecutors would need to charge the dead or the living. The Zodiac case remained a patchwork of credible facts, persuasive circumstantial links, passionate but conflicting theories, and a legal reality that requires evidence before action. The ciphers, once the most promising forensic artifact, had moved from being a potential key to being, at least in part, an epitaph for the culture of obsession the killer created. Legally, the Zodiac case remains one of the most famous unsolved serial killer investigations in American history. No one has been convicted for the Zodiac murders. The primary suspects named by the press and by authors were never charged. Arthur Leigh Allen, once a focus of public suspicion, died in 1992 without prosecution. Police departments and the FBI have kept the files open at various points. The case is officially unresolved in the sense that no person has been convicted and the killer's identity is not definitively established by law enforcement. The ciphers generated mixed outcomes. The 408 cipher was solved in 1969 by Donald and Betty Hardin. Their reading of the crude taunt was accepted by agencies involved in the case. The 340 cipher, cracked in 2020 by Orenchak, Sam Blake, and Jarl Van Eyck, yielded a plaintext that added texture but not closure. It amplified the killer's voice without giving a name. Other ciphers and fragments, shorter codes and peculiar letter endings still resist definitive translation and interpretation. In short, we may now read some of his words, but we still do not have the face that those words should point to. Beyond legal outcomes, the Zodiac case left a cultural legacy. It changed how the public interacts with violent crime, true crime fandom, amateur sleuthing, online forums that trade theories, and documentary filmmakers obsessed with minutiae all draw inspiration from the Zodiac's mix of murder and message. The killer created a brand, an emblem, a voice, a performance. That brand persisted. Books, films, and television series, some journalistic, some sensational, amplified the myth. Whether these productions help or harm the cause of justice is an ongoing debate. For families of victims and for survivors like Michael Mageau and Bryan Hartnell, the case's emotional toll has been lifelong. They have lived under the glare of interrogation and public curiosity, have replayed the nights of violence in testimony and interviews, and have been pulled into the orbit of theorists whose claims sometimes re-traumatize. The human cost cannot be measured only in forensic paperwork or solved ciphers. The Casebreakers' 2021 claim about Gary Poste reopened debates, drew renewed press attention, and reminded the public that every new theory demands careful vetting. Law enforcement responses made clear, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. When such proof is absent, the only responsible position is caution. To date, official agencies have continued to treat the Zodiac as unidentified, a conclusion that stands until evidence changes the legal ledger. Finally, the technical outcome is worthy of note. The Z340 solution was a victory for modern collaboration. Amateur cryptographers teamed with mathematicians and programmers to apply new techniques to old ink. Their work showed how decades-old cold cases can sometimes find new life when technology, curiosity, and patience converge. But it also proved a painful lesson. Even when a cipher is solved, human cruelty need not yield to words. Why does the Zodiac story lodge in our collective imagination? Part of the answer is theatrical. The killer did more than kill, he dialed up spectacle. He wrote his crimes into newspapers and made the public his audience. That story of theater meets violence is deeply unsettling because it implicates us. We read him, we printed him, and in printing his threats we gave him the attention he craved. Another part of the answer is the human craving for closure. We do not like unsolved endings. We like names, faces, verdicts. The Zodiac case refuses us those comforts. The ciphers teach us something else about language itself. Language can be a tool of confession or concealment, of cruelty or truth. The Zodiac used it as camouflage and a microphone. The decryption of the Z340 gave us words we could finally read, but those words were still theater, bluster, menace, the voice of someone who wanted control even from beyond the crime scene. If the Zodiac wanted to be understood, he did it on his own terms. Tonight, when you look at the image of those strange symbols, placid columns of unfamiliar shapes, remember that they were never just puzzles to be solved. They were instruments of intimidation, offered by a man who wanted to write himself into history. The words we finally read do not always deliver the closure we want. Sometimes they only remind us that behind every cipher there was a person who was cruel in the most ordinary, incomprehensible way. He stole life and left letters. If the Zodiac is still out there, a ghost named by rumor, or a dead man rumored to be unmasked, the final, most humane answer will come only when evidence unambiguously ties a name to the crimes in a court of law. Until then, the case remains a ledger of vanished lives and stubborn symbols, a violent puzzle that taught a generation that some mysteries insist on being both solved and respected. We can work to decode the past, but we must never forget the people whose lives those ciphers eclipsed.